Ever since we transition from a period of childhood to adulthood, right? Each passing day seems to become more burdened and each becomes more of a struggle than the previous one. But even in the midst of all these hardships, we cling on to the simpler and vacuous hope that someday we will reach a state of ataraxia. This this false sense of hope is developed as a coping mechanism projected out of our desire for childhood. We cling on to the possibility. We cling on to this misery by saying things like, "Oh, I was so happy in my childhood, so it's possible for me to be happy in the future as well." However, in my understanding, right, this misconception of happiness is merely yet another illusion. What I believe, is that as children, we just did not have any consciousness, almost as if we were bicameral beings with no sense of self or awareness, and the so-called happiness was basically a state of excitement. Well, there is another argument, right? As a as a child, we were simply in the state of being. We were not trying to be happy or trying to be miserable or anything. We were just being. There was no label to happiness or misery. But as we grow up, we are taught to be happy under certain circumstances and be sad under certain circumstances. And this these labels further distances us from the raw emotions, the paroxysms that we felt during our childhood. These emotions were, whether be positive or negative, these used to excite us. But however, as we grow up, if those paroxysm is negative, we are labeled with misery and somehow supposed to feel that misery is a bad thing, and somehow and then fall into a downward spiral of struggle and eventually loneliness. But everything, like as a child, right, everything, every activity, object, sensation, emotions were new to us, and it was novel. And it can be very easily deduced that novelty stimulates beings, even animals stimulate at new activities, things. But as we develop consciousness, these mere activities through routine repetition lose their novelty, and what was once fervent to us becomes tiring and boring, and in exchange miserable. Consequently, it becomes miserable. What remains is a void that our own consciousness, right, our own understanding becomes absolutely aware of, like increasingly aware of day by day. Like us as human beings, however, refuse to acknowledge this nothingness by subduing our own consciousness. We do this by isolating the void, and then life becomes merely a state of repetition in which we endure suffering. However, we endure this suffering by clinging on to the hope that we will somehow return to the happy state of childhood, which is merely an illusion, as we were never happy to begin with, but merely as a state of heightened excitement. Thus, the trajectory of life, right? The trajectory of life does not move forward, but merely attenuates towards a gradual exhaustion to nothingness. From a optimist like Nietzsche's will to power, first through motivation, which ridicules into a Schopenhauerian will to live, right? Then we eventually wait for our death. But when one becomes even increasingly aware, like more aware of the void, one moves towards the will to death, the millionaire's will to death, and might take their own death into their own hands and end their lives. However, I need to acknowledge that this might not actually be true, as we will never know whether it is true or false, since there is no correct answer to pessimism or optimism. It is simply my experience, which might have also because I never had a happy childhood, in the sense that one might feel. For me, my childhood was merely a cycle of abuse and violence. That's about it.